everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. I hope that you are all safe and well in your homes. My name is Irene Eden. My preferred pronouns are she and her, and I am the head of people operations at Hire. So we're here today in partnership with Workable to discuss a few diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives that HR and recruiting leaders can focus on while hiring may have slowed in their organizations. And I'm incredibly excited to talk with our amazing panelists. We're going to go ahead and kick it off with introductions. So I'm going to ask each of you if you could do a little self-intro and share a bit about your organization. Felicia, will you start us off with your intro?
Sure, happy to. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you again to Hired and Workable for putting this on. Really excited to talk. So my name is Felicia. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm the co-founder and co-CEO of an organization called She Geeks Out. We are based in Boston, but really in today's world, we're virtual, so we're everywhere. Our focus is twofold. On the one side of our business, we focus on creating community for women and their allies in tech and tech adjacent roles, where we connect people with each other on personal as well as professional levels and connect them with companies who want to hire them. And then on the other side of the house, which is where I spend more of my time as head of DE&I, we offer diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings for companies of all shapes and sizes in a variety of industries. We do a lot of work and have a lot of experience in tech, but it's not exclusively limited to tech. And so we're really focused on how do we move that needle towards greater inclusion across the board, whether it's within someone personally or with an organization. So really excited to be here. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Irene. Felicia, great to meet you. My name is Delozier Clemens, and I'm the Chief People Officer at Moz. At Moz, we're a company, we were founded in Seattle, but much like I said, we're all over the world now, working remotely. We search engine optimizations for SEO, where we're about 100 and I've been with the company for years. I've been in the industry for a long, long time, since the mid-90s, and it's great to be part of this panel. I said to Irene and Felicia earlier that I do have a needy golden retriever who may make an entrance. I think he might have learned to open the door, so just be aware of that. So great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I have an 8-year-old somewhere in the house. Probably you'll hear her singing some Frozen songs or something, so totally fine. So before we begin, I'd love to outline the agenda for us today. We're going to start off with a quick poll to gauge the audience about your current state of hiring. And then we have 3 topics that we're going to dive into that we're going to focus our panel questions on. The first topic is going to be around some near-term DE&I projects that can be implemented if an organization is seeing a slowdown in hiring. We're then going to talk about how HR teams operationalize pay equity and total compensation as part of their own processes and internal controls. And then lastly, we're going to discuss some ways that you can set the foundation for recruiting diverse talent now, so that when you are building your pipeline, again, you're building with integrity and intent, and you're ready to get those, achieve those diversity goals that you're building out for your companies. And then at the end of our content, we'll go ahead and move into a Q&A segment. So before we begin, let's take a quick poll to calibrate where we all stand in terms of hiring. I'd love to know from the audience, what is the current state of your hiring? Are you on a total hiring freeze right now? Are you currently building pipeline but holding off on offers for the time being? Has your hiring been uninterrupted and you're full steam ahead? Or are you taking this time to focus on objectives outside of hiring? And while you're taking a moment to input your feedback, just to elaborate a little bit more on these topics that we're going to touch on, we've heard that while a lot of our customers are experiencing a hiring slowdown, they are taking this time as an opportunity to focus internally on rebuilding processes, creating efficiencies that they have not previously had the bandwidth to accomplish. And so one of these priorities, which is going to be more important than ever, is tackling unconscious bias in our hiring. So with that feedback, we decided to put this together, and we hope that you all find value in our discussion today. So let's take a look at these poll results. So about 32% of our audience is actually full steam ahead with hiring. 31% are building pipeline, but offers are still on hold. And then 21% are on a total hiring freeze. That's actually great to hear, since I've heard that a lot of companies are on a hiring freeze. So to kind of segue into our first topic, we're going to be talking about actionable near-term DE&I initiatives that can be implemented now, in case your company is experiencing a halt in their hiring. So when companies start to unfreeze their headcount plans and start building pipelines again, having strong foundations around diversity initiatives is going to position companies well to allow them to achieve their diversity goals, since our applicant pools are going to be larger due to recent waves and layoffs and the shift to remote work. And a lot of people on this call, I bet, are looking for really actionable advice on how to build out or build upon any of their DE&I programs. So starting with you, Felicia, what are some low-hanging fruits that our audience can tackle in the midst of a potential hiring freeze?
Yes, absolutely. As I mentioned in my intro, we do a lot of work with different organizations on training, workshops. First thing is that we've seen a huge shift. So everyone's doing everything virtual at this point. Obviously, we are on this webinar together. That's also extending into things like training and efforts and initiatives. I do think that the reality is that a lot of organizations are, as we just saw from the poll, either on a complete stop or pausing or figuring things out. We're still kind of in the middle of what's going on right now. And so what I've seen be really interesting, and where a lot of our clients and potential clients are shifting towards in the last couple of weeks, has been to focus not so much on hiring or training or education around hiring, but really looking more towards just education in general. So with that diversity, equity, and inclusion lens, a lot of organizations are saying, okay, let's focus on people managers right now. We're not hiring. I actually have one client where they're not hiring at all. They just went through a round of layoffs, and they're still really, really invested in their people that they have remaining. And so they're like, okay, we're obviously not going to be hiring. We just can't support it, but we have some budget where we're going to invest back into the people that we have. We're going to offer them some kind of training, some kind of education, and it's really focusing on interactions, on things like microaggressions, how to be a better people manager, how to have more inclusive meetings. And now that we're all in this virtual world, really bringing that into the conversation as well. So I think education across the board is going to be a huge theme in general for a lot of organizations, even if you are actually still hiring. Education is still a really great way to push this forward and be that low-hanging fruit, especially given that a lot of us are in different types of work environments right now. Like, we're all working from home, or a lot of us are working from home, and we may have different schedules and different demands on our time. And so you both shared your potential interruption. I have an elderly cat who is my coworker who may also be interrupting, and sometimes I have to just push pause on what I'm working on and step away. Maybe that's a great time to read an article or a book. So I think that's going to be a really big piece of it, is just education in general. And then there are a lot of other ways and other things that companies are focusing on. So looking at policies and procedures that maybe that you haven't had the leisure to really take a step back and look at what's actually happening right now. Taking a look at your affinity groups or your employee resource groups. Do you have any, first of all? Secondly, if you do have them, how can you continue to support them? What does that look like in a virtual world? If you don't have them, what could we be thinking about to create them? So there's a lot of areas to play into there. And just because you may not have a ton of budget, or you may be still thinking about what's happening in terms of survival mode, doesn't mean that we have to completely pause the conversation. But I know, Rebecca, you have a lot of other thoughts too, so would love to hear from you.
Oh, that's great, Felicia. Yeah, I mean, I want to echo what you said about training and education. If you're already doing a bunch of training and education, maybe it's time to take a look at those course offerings, maybe retool them, recharge them. At Moz, we've done a ton of training on implicit bias, allyship, microaggressions, interview training, and so on. So want to echo that. And it might not even be training or education, it might be the conversation. So there are lots of opportunities to just begin or continue or enhance the conversations that you're already having. Also, I think it's a great time to research and begin to develop community partners, with organizations that can support your DE&I initiatives. They might be partners in areas of training and education. They might help with respect to the recruiting process, so candidate sourcing. They might be subject matter experts that help enhance the conversations you're having around diversity in your company. But it's a great time to research and either begin to develop those partnerships and or strengthen already existing partnerships. I think it's also a good time to get feedback and ideas from your employees. It's a great time to do a survey on getting opinions on how the company is doing with regard to DE&I, and most importantly, getting additional ideas for things that you can do in your company. I agree on the ERG's employee resource groups entirely, and I wanted to mention that our most active ERG is our GMIT group, Gender Minorities in Tech, and I now meet with that group after every meeting just to kind of debrief and talk about some of the topics they covered, some of the challenges they're facing, and really trying to bring more visibility in a potential way, of course, but more visibility to that group's challenges and needs and desires. So that's been really, really good. The final thing I wanted to mention, it's a time to focus on our cultures, and in particular around making sure our cultures are highly inclusive and that we're creating this sense of belonging for everyone. And one of the things that I love that we've done at Moz, maybe lots of companies have done something similar, but it's our Lunch and Learn series, and it's our Mozer Lunch and Learn series, where any Mozer can sign up to talk about a topic that is near and dear to them. It could be a passion project, or it could be a story about themselves and their lives. And it's really done a great job of emphasizing authenticity and creating that sense of belonging and inclusion and empathy for each other. Just one last thing on this, and one of my favorite ones, just to give you a sense of it, of how powerful they can be. We had a software engineer do a lunch and learn and share his struggles with panic disorder, anxiety, and depression. And it was so incredibly powerful and really brought people together, creating more empathy and inclusion for each other. So just to add to what you already said, Felicia, those are some thoughts.
Yeah, that is all really great advice, and we can totally relate here at Hired. This has been an amazing time that our ERGs have really stepped up. One of the first inclusion leads meetings that we had, I kind of wanted to be like this calming source, and I was trying to talk them through, like, I know this is a weird time, and I mean, they were my calming source, and they said, actually, we have this set up already. We would like to do this time management webinar. And they just have really come through and have supported our workforce. So having ERGs is a really great way to keep your culture engaged, specifically right now. Rebecca, as a leader in your organization, you understand the importance of these diversity initiatives for a growing company. For those that are on the call that are spearheading these initiatives for the first time, perhaps they don't have ERGs in place quite yet, how do you communicate the value of DE&I initiatives to get buy-in from stakeholders, especially the executive team?
Absolutely. As we were preparing for this call yesterday, I said to Irene and Felicia, and we'll share with everyone here, that at Moz, we're really, really fortunate. As our CEO, Sarah, is a huge supporter of DE&I, both within our company and externally as well in the broader tech industry and in our communities. She has often said that, closing the opportunity gap is not only the right thing to do morally, but it's good for business. And so there's so many reasons why creating a more inclusive and more diverse workforce and environment are good. And so I think if your proposals are being met with resistance, I would recommend specifically focusing on why it's good for your business and how it will positively impact, your business's results, outcomes, customers. It shouldn't take a ton of data to do that. I mean, I would focus on, it will result in better decision making, more diverse perspectives, better, building better products, attracting and keeping customers. I mean, there's so many things that that you could focus on in terms of why it's good for your own business. Two other things. Find and develop your allies. Like if your CEO is not going to be the top supporter or ally of your diversity efforts, then find your allies across the company. They are there. There are many, many people with influence that will be very happy to partner with you. And then the final thing, as I was thinking about this, that often executives, if they're going to agree to an action or an initiative or a program, they want to see results quickly. And so I do recommend, at Moz, we think about this as a marathon. It's not a sprint. That most of the things that we do around diversity and inclusion, we're doing to invest in the long haul, not to impact near-term changes at Moz. I mean, near-term changes are great and they may happen, but for example, we spend a ton of time with school age, middle school age girls and high school age young women. And we do that to give them visibility into, careers in tech and what opportunities exist, not because we're going to be hiring them, next month or next year necessarily, but it's really a long-term commitment. So those are a couple of thoughts.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump in really quickly because one thing you shared earlier, Rebecca, also sparked some thoughts for me as you were talking just now. I think that if you do see within your organization that stakeholders or senior leaders, C-suite, aren't really super bought in or aren't quite there yet, not every organization is so lucky to have leadership that's really invested and gets it. I would try and figure out where does that resistance come from, because a lot of times, here's the deal, is that there is so much research out there that shows the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And so if people can't get that at this point, then it's great to make the story for, business case and metrics and data, but the data is out there and it's been out there for a long time. What I find is that resistance a lot of times comes from places of fear, and especially when you're in a status quo where you may have leadership who are in positions of power, they have a lot of privilege. You have to sort of pull out, where does that fear come from? Where's the resistance coming from? And to your point earlier, Rebecca, where you shared the story about your engineer who was sharing the really impactful lunch and learn, I think storytelling can be a really wonderful tool to help sort of unpack where does this resistance come from and then try and overcome it a little bit. Because a lot of times there may be people who have really privileged backgrounds and don't have direct connections with underrepresented groups or groups who have had more struggles, or they don't really understand it. But if you can start to pull out those stories, or you're sharing it, you can find other people's stories to share, or even try and illuminate where in someone's family or their own experiences they might have something similar. That I found has been really, really wonderful and a really impactful tool to sort of get over that hurdle of just not wanting to deal with it or not thinking that these issues are important.
Yeah. That's great advice. And I think, when I'm asked this question, I do like to be very clear about, well, for myself at least, or for what I'm trying to do for my organization, I like to be very clear about the role of HR in these DE&I programs. And I often say that I'm more of sort of like a facilitator and an advocate versus these initiatives don't come from HR. So when you have these ERGs, these are their initiatives, and this is their space to kind of carve out what they want to do and what the change that they want to make in the organization. What we can do as HR people is help them operationalize this, help them find the data and information that's going to get the buy-in, help them build out the roadmaps that shows the executive team, this is why this is a great investment. Here's what my map looks like for the entire year. give them the coaching skills that they need to speak to an executive team. And that's one way you can really be an ally and an advocate and help them. But the initiatives and just kind of the mission of what they want to do, that's for them to decide and to develop for themselves. So these are great. These are great ways to move this initiative forward. So to kind of shift gears just a little bit, every year in conjunction with Equal Pay Day, we release our State of Wage Inequality in the Workplace report to fuel thoughtful conversations between tech talent and companies that are striving to reach fair pay. And as 3 women in business, we all, I'm sure, understand that this is a topic that's very important to us and that we hope every company has top of mind for themselves. We understand that in this crisis, priorities have shifted in really unfathomable ways. This is an unprecedented time. HR leaders are forced to develop plans for their organizations off the fly, and right now I'm sure everybody's kind of working on a return to work plan. But this is also an opportunity to build for the future. So from you both, I'd love to learn and shift to how you address pay equity and total compensation in your organizations. So my first question is for you, Rebecca. Working to achieve pay equity is a constantly evolving task. What processes have you put in place at Moz to ensure equal pay for equal work?
Yeah, this is top of mind for us, and we spend a lot of time both internally and externally speaking on the subject. Sarah as well as myself. So we are a small company, as I mentioned. I don't have a dedicated compensation team. But having said that, we haven't done a full-blown pay equity analysis, but at least twice a year, we do an internal review, as we do salary increase cycles twice each year, in April, in October. So we do an analysis on performance ratings, distribution of those ratings, position within grade, numbers of promotions. Those are the 3 that we look at consistently. And the groups that the underrepresented groups that we look at include gender, race, and age. So we do that twice a year, and then we look for any issues that need addressing. We also review pay levels for our largest job families, which primarily is engineering, not only, but primarily engineering. And we review each level, again, looking for discrepancies, disparities, things that don't that aren't matching up and that don't make sense, and then addressing them. So the semi-annual review process keeps us close to the data. It allows us to pretty quickly identify areas of concern and then to put plans in place. One example of this, just to kind of illustrate it, so last October in our cycle, when we did this analysis, we saw that many more women were in the first quartile than men. And so what we did know at the time was that we had more women being promoted in that cycle than men. So we thought, well, that may speak to some of that reason why we have women in that first quartile within their grade. So we kept a close eye on it. And then this cycle specifically, we dug at, and we saw that it had very nearly evened out, and that just as we had expected, women were progressing and moving into the second quartile after having spent 6 to 12 months in that new role. So that's just one example, but we do pay very close attention to it. We've done off-cycle adjustments as we see pay compression as a result of hiring as well. So it is absolutely top of mind for us.
That's awesome. Felicia, I'd love to hear if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, not a ton to add, because I know Rebecca just shared that Moz is a small company. We're probably even smaller. So we have a tiny little team. And we've only really, so I mentioned when I introduced myself, I'm a co-founder and a co-CEO. So my counterpart and I make up half the team, and then we have 2 other full-time employees. So in terms of pay equity, it's a little bit of an interesting discussion, especially given that both of those employees haven't quite even hit their year with us yet. So we hope to build in some of what Rebecca was mentioning in the future as we continue to grow and scale, hopefully. One thing we do to sort of address more the hiring aspect of it is when we do post open roles, we always put a pay range in there. And so that's part of the job description. And we put, the actual number. So for example, it might be, let's say the job is 30 to 60K. That's the range that we've come up with. And we come up with our ranges by doing a lot of due diligence in terms of what is sort of the benchmarks out there. What can we expect? What does it look like? And so we're not just pulling numbers out of thin air. And then when we actually start the process, one of the first questions we ask every candidate is, have you seen the job pay range? And a lot of times the answer is no, because they just didn't look at it. And so we start off with that question because we want to make sure that it works for them. And if it's not going to work for them, then we want to make sure that's clear at the very beginning, so we don't waste their time and they also don't spend time that they could be using looking at other organizations that might be a better fit for them. When we do get to the point where we're going to actually have a conversation about what that final compensation might look like, we internally come up with really clear guidelines as to what would indicate someone being offered on the low end of the range versus on the high end of the range. And then that way we have pretty transparent conversations when we're doing the negotiations and the final offer, because we want to make sure that people understand where we're coming from. And another really big thing that we focus on is we are very much, even though we're a small business, really tiny company, we're big believers in paying people and paying people what they're worth. So even with interns, we pay our interns, we pay everybody we can, and we don't have it, like we have no outside investment, so we're completely self-funded. Like I said, we're a small business, but we are very much focused on providing people with fair compensation. And so sometimes it has to go back to how do we have that conversation to explain why this is fair compensation and not just a random number that we've come up with. We are hoping that as we continue to grow, we'll be able to get more into the data and be able to start tracking things like promotions and things like that. That is a future goal for us.
Yeah, I mean, I know that you are smaller, but I do have to say that this is the time to start thinking about it. Most companies don't think about it until they're in later stages, and that is a very difficult time for you to rectify any gaps that exist. Imagine having to go to your finance team and say, hey, this initiative that I just kicked off around wage inequity, we now have this $2 million investment we need to make if we want to right size this. And it's a legal risk to your company if you don't. But now is the time to think about it. Just to share a little bit more to this topic, alignment here with HR and recruiting, or if your organization has a total compensation specialist, is extremely important here, because this is an area where pay inequities can seep into your organization, is the recruiting process. So ensuring that your recruiters are well equipped and empowered to speak to your compensation methodology can really help them in situations where they face offer negotiations. And it also requires having a very clear approach about how you approach negotiations, because negotiations in themselves are a big way that gaps can form internally. When your company starts to engage in offer negotiations, you're not exactly always aiming to be competitive here. That may be your intent, but instead what you're doing is you're actually rewarding people who have better negotiation skills. And there is plenty of data that shows us that men tend to be better negotiators than women. So you can align internally and perhaps consider a different approach. Instead of negotiating, use your compensation philosophy as a selling point for your company. Just talk to how, pay equity is very important to you. Another alternative you could do is say, hey, I can't offer you what you're looking for, but here, let's talk about what a sign-on bonus could look like. That way you're not adding to your base salary, you're not disrupting your base salary inequities, and in the long term, you'll be more equitable across the board. So may require some creative thinking, but there are ways that you can do that. So Felicia, my next question is for you. As businesses shift to a more flexible work environment, or even completely remote, will total compensation strategies, perks, or benefits, will they need to change to adjust with those shifts?
Yes, absolutely. 100%. And actually, as you were wrapping up, I had one final thought on the previous question, and I'll address the one you just asked. I am totally blanking on the company, and so apologies. I'll try and look it up after this webinar is over. But I did see relatively recently that there's at least one or two companies out there who are starting to say there is no pay range, there is just one salary, and this is it, and there's no negotiation. And so they're trying to figure out how can we actually take the burden off of the candidate in terms of that negotiation discrepancy by saying this is it, this is the final number. So that's a really interesting approach. I haven't come across it too much, but I did want to mention that because I thought it was a creative way of addressing some of those issues you just raised. With regards to, as we're shifting to this new world order, new flex work, one big thing, and we were talking about this yesterday, and it just is still so top of mind for me, but this issue around the fact that for a lot of us who are currently working from home, remote work and working from home is not the same as virtual work. And the difference there is that a lot of us had to very, very quickly switch over to working virtually. And what I want to make sure we think about is as we start to see reentry, as people start to go back, and it will happen eventually. It may be a longer time frame than we may like or hope for, but we will eventually get back into going back into the offices and having more of that, destination place to work from. And I'm really I don't want to say concerned, but really mindful of the fact that I don't want us to be looking back at this time and saying, oh, people were not very productive, so that means that remote work is not valuable. Because I think that it's actually the opposite, right? We're virtually working in a time that we were not prepared for, that we do not want to be in necessarily. There are a lot of us out there who really enjoy going to an office and need that structure. There are some of us who don't have spaces within our homes to actually be productively working. We have our coworkers, whether they're animal, child, partner, whatever that might look like, who are interrupting. So there's a lot of other stuff going on, not even to mention the stress and the grief and the trauma that's happening outside as well. So I think that from an organizational company standpoint, we will be seeing more and more people will actually want to now be able to work from home because we're proving that it can be done. And so I think that when we're thinking about benefits and other offerings, we'll have to start thinking about benefits that will actually translate to this reality. So for example, my team has been talking a lot about what does our actual setup look like? What's the equipment that we're using? I'm lucky in the sense I have 2 monitors, I have a desk, I have a chair that was already in my home beforehand, but a lot of people were used to going somewhere and having a work computer and a work chair and a work setup, and now I have to recreate that on the fly. There are people out there who don't have personal equipment. They don't have personal laptops. They don't have phone lines, so there's a lot of things that we have to be thinking about. One client I was actually just talking with the other day, they were an organization that was very much committed to not working from home. So their CEO was very much anti-remote work. When everything started happening about, I guess, almost 2 months ago, he very quickly made the decision to switch over to sending everyone home. And so within a matter of a couple of days, they went from never remote work to everyone is remotely working. And they gave everyone $1,000 stipend so they could buy equipment, buy desks, buy chairs, buy whatever they needed in order to be set up. I know some other of my colleagues and friends, their organizations, their companies actually let them take home chairs, take home desks, take home setups so that they could have that. And of course, as someone who lives in the Boston area without a car, that probably wouldn't have been feasible for me, but it's still nice to know that that would have been an option. And so that's something to be thinking about. And I think, again, just thinking about, what are the benefits that you're offering and what do people need? What do they want? And this is where, and I think both you, Irene, and you, Rebecca, mentioned sort of surveying your people, doing pulse surveys, doing engagement, getting feedback, and asking them what's been working, what's not working. If we were to implement future remote benefits or other things that could support you, what would that be? What would that look like? Maybe your people don't want $1,000, but they want they want something else. On my team, we actually offered to pay for Wi-Fi extenders for one of our people because she lives in a house with people with other roommates, and there was this starting to be a little, fight over Wi-Fi, and we're doing a lot of virtual content, and so we need to have strong internet. And so, we said this is a business expense, and so if you need to upgrade, let us know, because we're going to support that. It shouldn't have to be a personal expense. So I think a lot of these types of conversations will start to be more and more prevalent. And then one other final note before I kick it over to you, Rebecca, I know you have some thoughts on this too, is that we're starting to see, historically there's been this interesting discussion around compensation and, how compensation gets determined, and a lot of it does sometimes tie back to where do you live geographically. I was actually, we hosted a panel last night, and we had this wonderful speaker from Help Scout, which is a 100% remote company, and they were saying that it doesn't matter where people live, the compensation is the same across the board, because I think that that will become more and more of a conversation as well, because now people will say, okay, well, I now see I don't have to live in San Francisco. I don't have to live in New York, in Boston, in wherever else you might be living, where cost of living could be really high. And now they're seeing, oh, I went back to my parents' home in the middle of nowhere and everything's fine. So guess what? I'm going to do that permanently. And also, I don't want to see my pay go down. And I think that's going to be a real conversation. And, I'm not saying there's one right answer, but I do think that companies will have to be rethinking policies around compensation that may be tied to where people are geographically, because it will become more of an issue.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to echo that, Felicia, that although Moz has a regional, geo philosophy today, I think, I think that is going to change with more and more work from anywhere kind of and operation and policy. I definitely think we're going to see there, although I know a number of companies have already shifted to that pre-C19. The only thing I would add, really, that was, you just hit on all the major points. Moz, prior to COVID, had a very remote-friendly and distributed team-friendly operation. So it was a fairly easy adjustment for us. And so while we haven't fully outfitted home offices, for example, we really focus primarily on flexibility and just ensuring that whether you have kids or pets or other people in your home, multiple people working in small spaces, whatever is going on for you, that we want to acknowledge that this is an adjustment, and that flexibility in when work gets done, the need to step away during the day to take extended breaks. The meetings will sometimes get interrupted. I mean, we've just really emphasized that we understand this is a time for great flexibility. So that's been the emphasis right now. If we should choose to do this and go fully remote long-term, obviously we'll be discussing many of the things that you already mentioned, Felicia, in terms of how do we do that more effectively.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting shift, even in the last month or two, where we've seen this idea of empathy and that human connection entering in. It's so ironic in a way, because we're all separated, whether it's with masks or screens or social distancing.
Yeah.
Yet I feel like there's been such an emphasis on this connection. And even we were talking about this yesterday, we're able to now see inside each other's homes in a way that we never did before. And so, to your point about interruptions and sharing space, and it's just becoming like, I feel like every professional contact or friend or person that I've been talking with in the last few weeks has just said, yeah, at this point, I've met all my coworkers' kids. I've met everyone's friends. Like, it is the reality. In my team, what we've been doing is actually doing little apartment tours or house tours where we take our screens and we just walk around and we're like, this is where I live now. And so I just think that there's such a, I know this is veering off a little bit from the more like corporate benefit approach, but I do think that in general, work will be much more nuanced, because we're really seeing this rise of viewing people as an entire person. And there's always been this conversation around bringing your authentic self to work. Well, now we're bringing the work into the home. It's not the other way around. And so this idea of authenticity and transparency and vulnerability is just going to become, I think it's going to make it for a much more rich and nuanced work experience overall.
I agree.
Yeah.
I want to add one little thing that you just made me think of, Felicia. One of the best parts of this current situation is our team has started doing just a question of the day. And it could be anything from what are you having for breakfast to how are you going to treat yourself when this whole thing, changes, to a song that defines your life, to whatever it might be. And we've learned so much about each other that, we knew some of it, of course, when we were in the office together day to day, but it's added a richness and an empathy and a more complete understanding of the whole person. So it's been great.
Yeah, I would say empathy is the perfect word for executives and HR teams to have right now for your workforce. I can attest to just my work changing from working from home. I am now a full-time school teacher. I am now a full-time chef. I am a personal assistant to my daughter. There's just so many hats we are all wearing right now, and we just really need to be compassionate and understanding with each other during this time. So around the topic of communicating total compensation policies, at Hired, we offer every year, we do probably around February, March. I think we did February this year. We offer compensation one-on-one classes, and we just lay it all out exactly how we look at compensation, where we get our market data, where we level people within various salary bands. We talk about equity. Rebecca, at your organization, can you tell us a little bit about how you educate your company and your candidates on your total compensation philosophy and approach?
Absolutely. And actually, I'm just listening to you, Irene. I mean, Moz and Hired are taking a very similar kind of tack to it, a very similar approach. So Moz, we have a very clearly articulated pay philosophy and approach. Transparency is also a core value of ours. It's been very open about philosophy approach. With candidates, we talk about our process, and with Moz, we talk about it in onboarding. We hold compensation training sessions, kind of 101 sessions for managers. I typically hold those twice a year before each pay cycle. And then I've also held a number of, over the past, 3 years, held company-wide lunch and learns about compensation at Moz, how it works, what our philosophy is, with the goal of being to demystify, kind of remove the smoke and mirrors that seem to exist around what people make and why they make what they do. We've really focused on education. I'm not saying it's perfect. We still have work. I'm really, really proud of the strides that we've made around being more transparent. What we don't publish our full set of ranges at Moz. However, we've set the expectation. We're working towards greater transparency. We set the expectation that for everyone in the company, they should know what grade their position is in, what that range is, the minimum, midpoint, and max, and where they fall within that grade and why. And again, that's where the education comes, helping people understand that we target the midpoint of our grades to the 75th percentile and understand, well, what is it? How do you do that? And so lots and lots of education. What else to say here? Of course, we try to make this as objective as possible as well, in that, of course, we participated in a number of benchmarking surveys, both in Canada and the US, where we have most of our employees. But it's been really rewarding. I mean, I had someone who was at a big tech company here in town after one of the lunch and learns, come up and say, oh, no, okay, that was really, really helpful. That was useful. I get it now. And so that's been the goal. And again, we still have considerable work to do.
Yeah, I would like to pick out exactly what you said, the terms like work to do, a lot to learn. As part of our onboarding, we have an inclusion segment. And when I do that segment, I often will share, I identify as a woman, a Mexican-American woman, and I share points where I've actually been very naive in the things I've done and said. And it's really is, when you're talking about any DE&I initiative, when you're talking about achieving pay equity, when you're talking about transparency with comp, having a growth mindset is just ever so important, because it's about working towards making these initiatives better. And we say at Hired, diversity, equity, inclusion is everybody's responsibility, and it's a work in progress. And so be kind to yourself when you're building these initiatives out, and just have that understanding. So these are really very thoughtful responses, Rebecca and Felicia. I'd like to shift again to our last topic discussion about setting the foundation for recruiting diverse candidates. In a recent Hired survey of over 300 employers, 52% of respondents said that the top benefit of hiring remotely was access to more diverse candidates. Felicia, I'd love to start with you here. At Hired, we work with so many companies who all view diversity slightly differently. When companies think about recruiting for diversity, I think that the first thing you need to do is identify, what does diversity mean at your organization? What does diverse talent mean for you?
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it, because I do think that such a key first step is to identify and define what is diversity, and beyond that, what are the goals? I'll share two quick things on this. So one sort of minor story is that, as a small business that provides services in this area to other organizations, sometimes we'll get on a call with a potential client and they'll ask us, is your facilitation team diverse? And I always push back and say, how do you define that? And what do you mean? Like what are you asking? Because if you are asking what is the makeup of everybody, well, our facilitation team is all women. So in that sense, it's not very diverse. If you're asking about race and ethnic backgrounds, then yes, it is. And so there's a lot of ways to start to unpack that. And I do think that for some organizations, it's not necessarily their fault, but it's more around education and understanding the complexities of these topics. When they do say we're looking for diverse talent, what they really mean is we're looking to add more variety of backgrounds, experiences, and demographics to our current existing team. And they're using this label of diverse to really mean someone who is underrepresented, ergo someone who is not white, because that tends to be the status quo and the dominant groups that we see pretty much in every industry at this point. And so really starting to unpack that and move away from calling someone diverse, because as an individual, you can't be diverse. You can have a diversity of experiences, you can have different identities, but really looking at what is the group. And if your goal is to see more diversity within your talent pool, or in terms of the pipeline, or in terms of your team, then really start to look at that, as opposed to trying to find a diverse person, because that in and of itself is really it can be really demeaning too, especially for people who do have different identities, who don't want to be labeled in that way. And so recruiting for diversity to me really means bringing in more underrepresented groups, bringing in a more variety of viewpoints. And the key thing too is just breaking down the barriers, because a lot of the challenges that we see with this work in terms of bringing in a greater variety of experience is that we have conscious or unconscious, and artificial or not, self-imposed barriers where it might be that your company only recruits from a certain small group of universities and colleges, or they only look at people with traditional educational backgrounds, or you're only looking at networks or referrals from people who are currently at your organization. So just look at what those sort of guidelines or barriers might be, and then say and think to yourself, is this actually getting me to where I want to be, or is this maybe helping shape how we're seeing people come through right now, and maybe that's not what I actually want. So those are the couple questions I would push back with when you start thinking about these topics.
That's great.
I mean,
yeah.
Can I just say, Irene, that's
absolutely
powerful and beautiful. I really love the way you talked about it, Felicia. And just building on that, at Moz, I mean, we're generally talking about, when we're talking about diverse talent, we're talking about acknowledging and celebrating different perspectives, different background, different experiences, that, given who people are, that they will, bring to the table, and that there's a richness in that, and that will make stronger and better as a company and as a collective. I will say, as small and wanting to, kind of focus some of our efforts, we have focused primarily on 2 underrepresented groups at Moz. We focused on gender and people of color. And so that's been, most of our efforts have in a couple of groups. And of course, we welcome diversity well beyond that.
Yeah, I would agree. At Hired, our diversity metrics are very extensive. And just going back to kind of operationalizing this a bit, if you understand what your workforce looks like, you can build compensation or total rewards programs around what your workforce actually needs. So that's looking at how many parents do you have? Do you have employees that care for their own parents in forms of long-term care? You can maybe set aside resources that focus on that if you have a greater workforce who have parents in their homes. So it's a great tool to kind of expand how you think about diversity. So Felicia, as we have seen, the US, I read this morning literally that the US now has over 30 million people who are unemployed, most of which do not have a job to return to at the moment. This is going to cause a surge in applicants over the coming months, potentially even years. As we've seen a large shift to remote hiring, how can talent acquisition teams avoid bias during the remote interview process?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's only going to become more and more of an issue or concern really as we continue to go through this current time. A couple things, and I know we were talking a bit about this yesterday, and I think one of the challenges for all of us, no matter where we're coming from in terms of organization, industry, what have you, is that we're still in it, right? Like we haven't gotten through this pandemic crisis time to the other side yet. So we're still dealing with it right now. And I think that once we do get through the other side, we'll have more clarity around questions like this. But a couple things that come to mind for me right now is just really going back to your communication strategies. And I would say err on the side of over communicating as opposed to under communicating. Again, because we're all behind screens now, there's a lot of room for misinformation, there's a lot of room for confusion. Even I'll share really quickly this earlier today. So we hopped on this this webinar a little bit early to just prep and do some last minute discussion. And I was looking at the calendar invite and I was like, is it a Google Hangout link or is it the GoToWebinar link? And I was like, I think they said this other link, but I forgot because I'm dealing with all this other stuff too. Hopped on the Google link and there was no one else there. And I was like, okay, clearly I gotta go to the other link. But things like that where it's no, you know, no big deal. Like this was way early. I wasn't late to the webinar, but if I was a job candidate, just imagine like the stress that you go through and then I may not have been in my full, you know, ready to go mode. And so it just, there's a lot of stuff that can build and build and trickle down in that way. Also, given the fact that we're, you know, at least for the near future, a lot of us are doing remote hiring and remote interviewing and remote conversations, just thinking about, you know, what are the expectations and have you communicated those expectations to the other party? So for example, if you send out a video link and the other person dials in with a phone, is that a problem or is that something that you need them to be on video? Do you not? You know, thinking about not everyone is going to have access to a laptop computer or have good internet, you know, and so just thinking about other ways that you may be making judgments about someone that they may not be able to control. Like they may not be able to control a crying child in the background. You know, not like before where you could say, okay, you know, I'll step into my office or I'll take this call at work or I'll take this call somewhere else or I'll do this, you know, separated. Like there's a lot more demands. And so we have to really be checking ourselves and thinking about what are the judgments that we are bringing to the table? Are they accurate? Are they not? Are these situations out of someone's control? And are there ways that you can minimize any stress or any miscommunication before you even get in touch with someone? And I would also say one other thing, which isn't really necessarily related to bias during a remote interview, but I do want to point out that in the future, even years from now, we're going to be seeing large gaps on people's resumes because 30 million people. I think the notes we had, so a couple days ago, it was 22 million. So it's 30 million today. It's going to be probably more tomorrow. Like, there is a huge amount of people out there who are unemployed through no fault of their own. And it doesn't mean that they were doing a bad job. Some people's businesses have vanished, industries have vanished overnight. And so we need to really make sure, and I'm sure that a lot of us are already there, but just to reiterate it and name it, that we're not judging people unfairly by looking at gaps during this time, especially, and asking, what were you doing during this time period? How productive were you? Why were you unemployed? Those questions need to go out the window because they don't matter, right? And so it's really about, as interviewers, making sure we're focusing on the things that we actually need to know and not unfairly judging or unfairly assessing someone based on things like a gap or that they didn't come up with the next amazing American novel while they were unemployed. So just a couple of things to keep in mind there.
Yeah, absolutely. I would 100% agree with all of that. That brings us to the end of our content, and I do want to move into our Q&A segment shortly. But before we go into our Q&A, thank you both so much for sharing all of your insights. I do want to tell you a little bit more about Hired and Workable, so feel free to enter any questions into the chat. Hired is a career marketplace that intelligently matches tech talent with the world's most innovative companies. We combine cutting-edge technology with unbiased career coaching so both talent and employers can find the right fit faster. With reduced bias mode and Hired assessments, you can focus objectively on a candidate's skills and experience and avoid unconscious bias even during remote hiring. And a little bit about Workable. Even now, when businesses feel anything but usual, you can still keep your interviewing and hiring on track. Video interviews, Workable's new candidate screening tool, is now free on their platform during this time when we're all faced with hiring virtually. So to save you a significant amount of time and money spent on screening candidates, talk to them if you'd like to learn more. And if you'd like to learn more about Hired and Workable, please let us know by if you'd like a demo by checking the box on the screen. So we have some amazing questions that are coming through, and while we sort through those, we will go ahead and post our SHRM code on the screen for you all who are looking for that. Let me just see what questions we have in the chat. All right, so our first question is from Celine for Rebecca. Are there specific online trainings that you would recommend to educate around DE&I?
Well, great question, Celine. We have only thus far done live trainings, and we've partnered with a couple of Seattle-based organizations to offer those trainings. I believe implicit bias, we're in the process of taking that content and moving it online, but I would put a shout out to, I might have to get you both names to Irene and we could share those out, but Ada Developers Academy is a local women's coding program here in Seattle, and we have partnered very closely with them on much of our content.
Yeah, I would shout out in San Francisco an agency called Survivor Alliance. Actually, your ERGs hosting these trainings is a really good way to get them engaged. So if you have HR specific budget for trainings around diversity, kind of position it for the ERGs to utilize and have them be that voice. That's a really great way to empower your ERGs. Our next.
Oh, sorry, I have to shout out, obviously, check out She Geeks Out. We are doing all virtual all the time. We've transitioned quite a few of our clients from in-person to virtual, and have been doing virtual since 2017. So definitely feel free to check us out too.
I'm talking with you, Felicia, after this.
Our next question is from John for Felicia. What is the most impactful DE&I program that you've implemented for your clients?
Oh, that's a great question. Let's see. I would say there's a couple that kind of come to mind immediately. It's hard to say because there's so many different trainings, of course, that are out there that focus on different topics, and each company and organization brings a different wealth of background and experience and people to it. We did some work with, in the Boston area, it's a local company in Somerville called Form Labs, where they actually went through some of our trainings, and then they ended up switching up the way that they put their job descriptions out there. So they were pretty early on in terms of putting a diversity and inclusion statement as part of all of their job descriptions, and put some language in it where it said something like, if you are reading this and you don't necessarily check all the boxes, but you still think that you're interested, or you might be a fit in some way, reach out, because you know, it's okay to not check off every single box. And there's obviously so much research that goes into that, how that can become a very gendered way of looking at job descriptions. And so they actually saw a lot of really great response from doing that. We've also seen some really impactful programs where the sort of the driving force came from the top down. So there was a restaurant group that we worked with where the CEO was the one who was like, we're doing something around this. We ended up training their entire C-suite team. They had a great time, great experience. So we rolled it out to all of their managers across the country last year. And that was really impactful, because it was, I think a lot of times you see bottom up, but not always top down. So I think top down can be an amazing way to really leverage that power that you have.
That's great. And unfortunately, it looks like we are out of time. So I do want to thank the audience for joining us today, and our amazing panel, Rebecca and Felicia. Thank you both so much. We've covered a lot of great content. If we didn't get to your question today, we will definitely try and answer them via email. And if you would like to continue the conversation with us, please feel free to add all three of us on LinkedIn. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and please stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Irene. Bye.